Steve, that's not the right call at all.
And we're live. I have no voice. Welcome to the 11th Ohio live stream. Wow.
You sound terrible.
I do sound terrible. Well, we were out drilling all day today, riding and yelling in the wind and 30-some degree temperatures. So appreciate you guys joining us. As you know from the announcement, wow, I can't talk at all. But what you guys saw from the announcement is that we have our very own Brandon Lewis.
Hello.
From the Draper Museum of Natural History, right?
Yes, we're one of 5 museums that are actually at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West up in Cody, Wyoming. But I get to work with the live birds of prey there and educate all the tourists as they're going in and out of Yellowstone National Park about some of the raptor species that they're going to be seeing or are about to see as they're passing through the region. So,
awesome.
Lots of fun.
Right, exactly. So as far as everything going on, this is the story of Old Abe. For those of you who don't know what Old Abe is, what's the story? Just kind of like a real snapshot before we get into bald eagles in general.
Sure, yeah. So tonight we're going to be talking about Old Abe. He is actually the regimental mascot for the 8th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry in the war. And so what we're going to do tonight is tell you a little bit about bald eagle facts just in general, so you have a brief background of that, and then we're going to go into some cool stories about Old Abe and kind of go from there.
Awesome. No, that sounds good.
Yes, but before I forget, I have to actually share the actual call of a bald eagle.
Okay, so the sound you guys heard to begin with was not a bald eagle, and you see on the movies the screeching hawk sound that they put and they overlay with the bald eagle, right? What does a bald eagle actually sound like?
So this is the call of a bald eagle.
That's what a bald eagle sounds like.
Yes. It's a lot squeakier. It's a lot kind of, I don't know, it's just higher pitched. More of a cackle than an actual
so that classic
screech.
Movie, just screeching hawk, that's not a bald eagle at all.
No. And Hollywood, in its great wisdom, decided that the red-tailed hawk sounded so much better than what an eagle actually sounds like. They actually will utilize that soundbite for pretty much any bird shot that you see in any sort of film. Whether it's an eagle or not. That's just the sound effect that you're going to hear. So anyway, bonus info for you.
Right. So getting into bald eagles, because we have a lot to cover.
Yeah, we're going to be moving.
Hopefully hour.
We'll be moving fairly quickly here.
Okay. So again, the story of Old Abe, basically it's a bald eagle with the 8th Wisconsin, right? Mm-hmm. 8th Wisconsin Infantry. How in the world do they get an eagle to fight with them, to march with them, to basically live with them?
Yeah, so it's, are we jumping ahead? Or are we?
No, go ahead. Just get into bald eagles.
So we'll just do bald eagle facts real quick, then we'll get to that story.
Sounds good.
Great segue, though. Hold that thought. So with bald eagles, hopefully everyone's familiar with them by now, but they are one of 2 species of eagles that are native to North America. They're only found in North America, ranging from Alaska, obviously they're very common up there, going all the way down to northern parts of Mexico even. But they are going to be found nesting in riparian zones, usually near a good-sized body of water. Or not in, but nearby, because that's where they get their primary source, which is generally fish. But they will build large stick nests up in the trees. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Lay anywhere from 1 to 3 eggs, depending on the amount of resources available in the region, every single spring. And they mate for life, but they don't mourn for a minute if something happens to their significant other. But they are going to be a really neat eagle species. They are going to let's see. Wow, there's so much to talk about with these guys. Okay, so
the question I have is, say, the habitat, right?
Okay.
So again, being in the Civil War, of course, we're in Wyoming, so anything in the Civil War is back east. Mm-hmm. I guess I didn't realize bald eagles lived in that area at that time. So I guess where is their habitat normally?
So it's like I said, riparian zones. It's near dense forests. Forests and waterways, basically. But they need a good-sized tree to build those nests in. Gotcha. But you can see the breeding areas and wintering and summer areas that you're going to see bald eagles hanging out in here in this image. But they will move a little bit. Sometimes, they're not quite as migratory as some of the other species. We always think all the species will head down to South America. These guys will stick around year round, but we're still learning more about them. Sometimes, if I remember correctly, they're going to move short distances. So you might see some bald eagles move a little further north. Some might move further south, just in a search for food. So generally, they're going to be. You can find bald eagles year round in this North America, basically.
Gotcha.
That's fun. But they're going to eat a lot of different things. Not only fish, that they are a a fishing eagle. Good grief. So they love fish, but they also are going to be going after lots of waterfowl like ducks and geese. They're going to go after prairie dogs, lots of rabbits, and they will scavenge quite commonly as well, believe it or not.
Gotcha.
Both bald and golden eagles are going to feed on carrion or roadkill or something out in the field somewhere. It's an easy meal, especially when food is hard to come by in the winter months. Like in this image here, and those are actually both bald eagles, and which brings up our next point here. So this is a image of a juvenile bald eagle, and a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of the fact that bald eagles will actually change feather coloration as they mature. So this is probably around late 1 year, maybe starting to get into a 2-year bald eagle. Yeah, I'd say closer to 1. And they start out all dark brown. And they are going to gradually molt out their feathers as time goes on each year and systematically replace that with some different colored feathers.
So actually, this is why we threw that picture in there of that, what looked like a golden eagle, for those who are undereducated. But that picture we saw that looks like a golden eagle, we put that in there for the Old Abe talk because when Abe first got into the Civil War, he didn't have the white head and the white tail feathers. He looked like molted brown, golden kind of a deal.
Yeah, he did not look like a bald eagle as most people know them. So this is pretty much what Old Abe would have looked like in that first year that he was found, which will lead into that story. So our next graphic is going to show you the progression of the growth and the molting of a bald eagle. And you can see they start out dark brown with that dark black beak, and then you'll have you can't see the body image. We'll show you a little later on here in a second. But there you go. So the bald eagle is go back one. There you go. So the bald eagle on the right is you can see it's probably getting into 2 years. It's starting to have a little more of the white feathers on the rest of its body, kind of speckled there. And by year 3, you're going to start to see the white head and tail feathers growing in.
So you're saying the one on the right here is actually a bald eagle?
Correct, yeah. And then by year 5 or 6, they should have that iconic white head, dark brown body, and a white tail feather, just like we would expect a bald eagle to see, and that bright yellow beak. So a lot of people confuse bald and goldens just because they start out both dark brown. We'll go back one image here, go to the juveniles. There we go. And there is actually quite a difference. Golden eagles are found all over the northern hemisphere of the globe. Bald eagles are only found in North America, but you will see both here. Generally, the golden eagles like to be in the more open areas overlooking the vast prairies, sagebrush, and the steppes and the plains, and they like to nest on cliff ledges typically. Bald eagles are going to be pretty much anywhere there's a good-sized body of water and some good trees, as long as there's a food
Which actually
source.
brings us to the story of Old Abe. Now, obviously, this picture right here is a famous picture of Old Abe, but obviously with his head being white. This is later on.
Yes, this is.
Do you know, is this a war date picture or is this later on?
Either is in 65 or post-war.
Gotcha.
I believe, but I don't have an exact date on that one. This you can see is a little earlier on during the war, and you can see he is a little bit more mottled. He's got the darker streaks still on his head. His beak is still a little bit dark, but then that first image is when he's fully matured.
Gotcha.
So, anyway, bald and golden eagles. Golden eagles are more closely related to red-tailed hawks. bald eagles are more closely related to the fishing eagles.
Gotcha.
So anyway, yeah, they're completely different species.
So we bring that, we had to talk about that, especially the coloring difference, because Old Abe, being a bald eagle, didn't look necessarily like a bald eagle at that time, especially early on in the war when he first got in with the 8th Wisconsin, right?
Correct.
So let's talk about, get into the story of Old Abe then, and how in the world did he stay with the 8th Wisconsin and not fly off? So what's the story of Old Abe then?
So Old Abe is a really neat story, because this is basically the foundation of that patriotic image. I mean, the bald eagle was chosen as the national symbol of the United States of America. I believe it was way back in 1782. The date might be slightly off, but about in that time. It invokes such patriotic imagery. In this story, this is the first time a live bald eagle is now going to be seen by the public in military parades, in war. So we have a really nice poem that was written in one of the biographies, I guess, of Old Abe. And it's, the ancient poets say that an eagle furnished Jupiter with weapons in his war with the giants and armed the skies. Is it all a fable? Are not symbols the instruments of corresponding action? Does not our dear old flag suggest to the patriot a great truth, the priceless value of the American Union? What, then, can better enkindle the fires of valor and intensify them into unquenchable light, that the imagery of the bald eagle, whose realm and glory is among our stars? If the shadow thus nerves the soul, what must the real create but impetuous energy in the battle shock? The live emblem of our liberty, Persian and Roman as a military standard, what sure augury of conquest over base rebellion need the soldier ask?
So that's actually the golden thread that goes through the rest of the story of Old Abe, is just the fervor of patriotism and just America. In fact, we'll get to this later, but he actually captured a Confederate.
He did, in an indirect way.
We'll get into that.
So that's a little teaser for you. But so Old Abe was found originally in 1861 by Agama Wegazig. That was a member of the Lake Flambeau tribe of the Chippewas. And they lived along the Flambeau River. They basically found Old Abe in a nest when he was about 4 to 5 weeks old. They acquired this eagle. They actually chopped the tree down, and there were 2 chicks in the nest originally. One of them did not survive, probably due to injuries.
So they just chopped the tree down?
They did, yeah.
So that's how Old Abe actually was found?
He was chopped out of a tree by a member of the Chippewa tribe. Yeah, it sounds terrible, but... So it's a very interesting read if you actually do some in-depth research about him. There's a lot more to it. But basically, the son of this chief acquires this tiny little fuzzball of down. He was just starting to get some dark feathers. He was probably about 5 weeks of age, based on what they talk about in what he looked like at the time, and that's about what bald eagles are going to look like. And they raised him as a pet. And so one thing I wanted to mention real quick is that in imprint, did I already read this?
No, you didn't talk about it.
I didn't. Okay, sorry. I've been reading all these notes beforehand. So imprinting is a form of learning in which an animal gains its sense of species identification. Birds do not automatically know what they are when they hatch. They visually imprint on the parents during a critical period of development. After imprinting, they will identify with that species for life. And that's exactly what happened with Old Abe. Gotcha. He was young enough that in that critical growth period, he was in such a close proximity to humans, and they fed him, they took care of him. They became the parents for Old Abe. And so he associated with people. He did not learn the important things that a bald eagle needs to know in order to survive. Instead, he learned that mom or dad looks like a human and they bring me food every day. And so he's going to stick around because they keep feeding him and that sort of a thing. And so one thing that is really neat in my experiences as a raptor handler and working with these birds in captivity, educating people, imprints they behave a lot differently than wild birds that have been born, or I guess hatched and raised by their parents in the wild.
Because you actually deal with a lot of birds, a lot of raptors that did not imprint. In
Correct,
fact, the eagle that you handle was not, right?
No, he was hatched and lived as his life as a wild bird. So one thing real quick, all of the birds that we care for at the Center of the West, they are with us due to a disability of some sort, so they can no longer be released to survive on their own like we would normally hope for back into the wild. So instead we take good care of them, and basically they get room service for the rest of their lives. So
Gotcha. So let's get into how he gets to the 8th Wisconsin then. So an Indian basically gets him.
He gets them. They want food. Times are hard, and so they actually traded Old Abe in a roundabout conversation and how things worked out. But basically,
so the Native Americans actually traded Abe.
They traded a tiny young eagle, and he was growing pretty fast. But they traded him to Daniel McCann of Eagle Point, Wisconsin, for a bushel of corn.
For a bushel of corn.
For a bushel of corn. They were hungry. And so Daniel McCann, he thought this was such a novelty, and he actually, helped raise the bird. A few more weeks, it rapidly grew, and he realized this is probably not the best thing to have around a farm. But he said in his writings that all of a sudden he knew that the eagle had to go join the war effort. So
obviously the war was going on by this time.
Yes. So this is still 61,
Gotcha.
and there was a new company forming for the 8th Wisconsin over in Eau Claire, and so he traveled there with Old Abe, and he basically shows up with this young eagle and says, "Hey, you want to buy an eagle?" And it's for the cause. And so the soldiers it was Company C of the 8th Wisconsin, they kind of passed the hat around, and originally it's for 20 cents each. I think they all kind of kicked in, and they ended up buying Old Abe for $2.50.
So they bought Old Abe for $2.50.
Yes, from the farmer, and then he kind of indirectly started to gain popularity with the guys, and he became the mascot for the 8th Wisconsin. He had his adult plumage by this point, so he's kind of a scruffy dark brown bird.
So like this picture right here.
Very similar, yeah, maybe a little younger in that. I don't know when that photo was taken either. I probably should have written this all down, but I have so many notes. Anyway, so he is part of the regiment now. They march through... let's see. No, he goes to Camp Randall first. Sorry. Double check the notes here. Okay. He went to Camp Randall, and this epic moment happened where they decided if they're going to carry an eagle with them around with the regiment, they made a special stand for him. So they had a staff, and they had a shield of the Union, and they actually had really ornate arrows coming off the side and 2 little American flags, and then there's this little perch for this eagle to sit on, and they actually tethered him eventually just because you didn't want to lose him, because he did have a tendency to move around a little bit. More on that in a second. But as they're going through the gates to Camp Randall, where everyone's getting organized and forming up as an actual regiment, they said when the regiment marched into Camp Randall, the instant the men began to cheer, Old Abe spread his wings, and taking one of the small flags attached to his perch in his beak, he remained in that position until borne to the quarters of the late Colonel Murphy, who was the regimental commander at the time. And so this was kind of the first, whoa, this is really awesome, that patriotic fervor. The people are cheering, the troops are cheering, and Old Abe is waving a little flag. So that kind of kicked it off. And then they're marching through... Chicago, I think, on their way south during the war, and Old Abe flew off, which actually has happened at some bird shows, not us, but at other facilities.
So they're going through Chicago.
They're marching in this parade, and all of a sudden Old Abe just lands on a taller building and sits there for a half an hour. And meanwhile, everyone's marching by and nobody really knows what to do. And there's like a small group of really concerned guys from Company C that have fallen out, and now they're kind of trying to chase this eagle around, and eventually they got him down. They coaxed him down with some food and got a hold of him. That's not the only time that happened. There was another time, another city they're passing through, a friendly policeman managed to bring him back after he flew off. So there's lots of cool stories like that. But Old Abe really kind of got into his element at the Battle of Corinth, Mississippi in 1862, I believe. Yes. So this is kind of what the media latched onto, and it just exploded from there. And let's see here. This was written by one of the Eagle Bears, David McLean. At the commencement of the Battle of Corinth, on the 3rd of October, he got frightened, broke his string, or it was cut by a mini ball, and fluttered off, but did not go far before I caught him again. The rebel General Price saw him there and ordered his men either to capture or kill him, and at all hazards, stating that he had heard that that bird before, and would rather capture him than the whole brigade. I had this statement from rebel prisoners and believe it to be true. The eagle seems to have a dread, like all old soldiers, of heavy musketry, but it is in all his glory when the roar of artillery commences. I have had him up to the batteries when they were firing into the rebel ranks as fast as they could load, and then he would scream, spread his wings at every discharge, and revel in the smoke and roar of the big guns. The first fight he was in was the Battle of Farmington, Mississippi, which was on the approach to the Battle of Corinth. Let's see. And basically, he was a short distance behind the line, and the Eagle Bear actually was part of the color guard. And so he formed on the left of the color guard every time that they formed up for parade or marching, that sort of a thing. But during the line of battle, when that was formed, he fell back a short distance with the handler, and they just kind of stood there behind the main battle line. In this instance, they were ordered to lie down because the fire was so intense they were receiving from the Confederates, and only the color bears stood upright. Everyone else lied down, and it was kind of their chance to be like, we're pretty cool. And
so everyone is laying down.
And everyone is laying down but the color guard. And
Old Abe is up with the color guard.
Old Abe is up with the color guard, but he doesn't want to be up. As the story goes, he basically wants to keep flying down to the ground and lying down alongside the men because he's gotten used to working with them so closely. Yeah. And the Eagle Bear is so upset because he wants his really badass moment, and the eagle is like ruining it for him. So eventually he lied down, and everything was fine. So, and the men laughed quite a bit because I'm not going to expose myself to fire if you guys aren't. So,
right. So Old Abe was the same way.
But there's lots of other good stories. But during this battle, though, Old Abe, he somehow broke his cord, or it was cut by a mini ball. He got loose, flew about 50 feet down the length of the battle line. And basically, the way they describe it, the media saw this, and Harper's Weekly wrote a good article about it. And basically, it became this very romanticized, very sappy, patriotic fervor article of how this eagle, soared over the battle and screamed on and cheering on the good old boys for the Union and so forth. When really, in actuality, the eagle handler is going crap, 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 and like running down trying to get this eagle back. And Old Abe really didn't know what was going on and managed to get him up, and they quickly escorted him behind the scenes safely, behind the lines where it was more secure and they wouldn't lose him.
So, I mean, with that example then of him, I guess whether it's a mini ball or whatever happened as far as getting loose, like being an eagle handler yourself, like what really was he thinking? I mean, obviously from what the Harper's Ferry reporters wanted is this awesome, majestic thing. But, what prompted that eagle to get off his perch, fly away, and then try to get chased down?
My guess is that he was spooked by the intense fire that was going on. And I mean, the way they described it, they said he was not a big fan of musket fire anyway, just like any of the old soldiers. But artillery, for some reason, he was good with that. But he probably got spooked. And when he got loose, it was just a panicked flight, and he landed, and it was kind of a stunned that he actually got loose, and then they quickly gathered him up. Most likely that's what happened, at least in my opinion.
Well, didn't you actually, you actually have a story, you mentioned the flags that were on either side, originally the flags on either side of the stand, and he actually, didn't he, snap one off and like hold the flag in his mouth. And
Yeah.
that
was when he was going into Camp Randall. Or I
Okay,
don't know
that's
if they
right.
snapped it off, but he hung on to it and just kind of...
Right, so he's walking in, snapped off the American flag. He recorded like little American
teeny
flag, and he
ones,
had it
yeah.
in his mouth.
But everyone just ate it up.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
Again, from a bird perspective, what probably happened?
Most likely, he was just annoyed that this little tiny flag kept flapping at him, and so he just
annoyed.
Stop! And he grabbed it and broke it off and just hung on to it, and everyone thought it was awesome. So
Well, I mean, that's what birds generally do when they're annoyed. Is they either like a dog or maybe like a horse is like you pat at it or snap it or something.
Well, no, that's probably not a good no. Generally, they really don't go after dogs or horses or that sort of thing.
No, I'm saying
but-
like a dog puts like
Oh,
when
okay,
something
similar.
is annoying
Okay, yeah,
them,
yeah.
they
If
kinda
it's
pat
like
at it.
stop, more like a
Yeah.
or a cat maybe, but
Actually, a cat would be better.
it's probably stop and
Right.
bats it away. So that's most likely what he was doing. Also, that same sort of patriotic fervor, it actually caught him a prisoner. And so this is actually from an account from a surgeon for the Union, and this was at the Big Black Bridge around Vicksburg, and he was treating wounded, and he finds this Confederate that had received a shot of buck and ball, and so he started asking him about it, like, okay, well, we don't use buck and ball for the most part for with the rounds that the men in the Union had, and so he inquired more about it. And he said here, I have always been a great lover of French and American history, in which the eagle figures so extensively as an emblem of freedom. And when I saw a live eagle floating and fluttering over your soldiers yesterday, just in front of my regiment, all of my old love of American freedom and loyalty returned. And shortly after, when we were obliged to run, I believed our cause was unjust, and so haunted was I with thoughts of disloyalty and being an enemy to and fighting against that eagle, that I determined to desert the rebel cause and come to his protection. The first opportunity I saw this morning was when I made for a rush for your lines and was fired on by one of our men.
So basically, Old Abe.
He
he's
struck such an
during the battle.
image. Yeah, he somehow was up above the troops, and this Confederate sees this bald eagle just kind of hanging out and jumping around and waving his wings, and it inspired him to basically turn himself over. And he couldn't fight it anymore.
And that's how Old Abe got his first and only Confederate prisoner, I guess.
Yeah, indirectly. Yeah,
indirectly.
So that was pretty neat.
So inspired.
He did receive some minor injuries during the war. Some of his feathers were shot away. And if you're familiar with the way a bird's wing is, it's going to have mostly feathers on the lower part of the wing. Well, lots of feathers. It's a bird. But basically a little bit of muscle and bone at the leading edge of that wing, and mostly feathers just kind of hanging out there. So if something happens to those feathers, so say, for example, a mini ball goes through them, there's really no body part that it's actually hitting. It's just going to break the feathers, and eventually that bird is going to molt the feathers out, whatever damaged feathers they have, or it might pull them out and new ones will grow in. It takes about 2 weeks from start to finish for new feathers to grow in. Several times he did have some close calls, but he was never actually injured directly during any of his wartime experience.
So the whole war, he never, being in battle,
Yeah.
And the 8th Wisconsin wasn't just in the back of the lines, just
No,
doing nothing.
they were a very active Western unit, they were in the heart of a lot of different actions. Some of the more notable actions they took part in were New Madrid, Island Number 10, Farmington, Siege of Corinth, Iuka, the assaults at Vicksburg, Pleasant Hill, in numerous skirmishes. And so he actually participated, I believe it's in about 30 skirmishes and, about maybe 20 or so actual major engagements during the Civil War. So he was all over the place with the 8th Wisconsin. And they saw lots of leadership changes, as with many of the guys during the war. And through that time, they actually had 5 men that acted as eagle bearers for Old Abe.
5 guys.
Yes, and basically they held them until, for whatever reason, they gave it up. Kind of a short side story. One of the eagle handlers actually gave up his position because they got so tired of Old Abe actually flying off of his perch. They cropped his feathers. Is that the right word? Oh, that's probably not the right word. But basically, clipped his wings. Cropped. Where did I get that one? They clipped his wings, and so on one wing and his tail. And so basically, when you do that, the bird can get no lift under their wings, but at the same time, when he spreads his wings out, screams and flaps his wings, you don't have that awesome, majestic, full feathered bird look. And so that's why he was so upset, so much that he actually resigned his position, which was a very nice position because your whole job was to care for Old Abe. And you were exempt from any extra duties, and you could basically just fall out and acquire food for the eagle, which they had to do either through trade. There's lots of side stories of them going out and actually either buying or absconding with chickens throughout the South to feed Old Abe. They'd go fishing for him. He loved to take baths. He took a bath at an hour at a time, they said. So there was a lot of extra work keeping an eye on this eagle, who did get into quite a bit of mischief in his time as well. But during his wartime experiences, they used Old Abe as interesting though it may sound, it's as a barometric pressure device, basically. And so birds are very sensitive to pressure changes if there's a new storm front coming through. And so this is really unique for the time because this is the only unit that I'm aware of in the Civil War that if there was a storm front blowing through, Old Abe would be very anxious and flappy and just bouncing around and really hard to manage during their time in camp. And that would give them a heads up that sometime that night or the next day, there's going to be a storm and it's going to let loose. It's going to rain. And so they had time to actually build shelters and prepare for it. And so they used him as a barometric pressure device, which was kind of cool.
So one of the questions I was wondering, so that he was like that in battle, how was he around camp? I assume there was stories around, the normal everyday camp life. How was he like?
He got into all sorts of mischief. He actually, there was a couple soldiers he was not fond of. He was always nice to his eagle handlers, but sometimes people got on his wrong side. They either thought they'd poke fun at him and poke him with the stick. That was a bad mistake because then you have this really pissed off bald eagle coming after you and chasing him around camp. There's lots of little stories like that, so it gets pretty interesting. And they would roll mini balls at him, when things were really slow in camp and there wasn't a lot of action. They would actually roll them towards him, and he would pounce on them, and then he would roll them back at him. Right. So it was great entertainment for him and the guys.
So I guess that's kind of an interesting camp life. Imagine there was dogs and there was other animals, kind of. But having a bird is kind of unique, obviously. That's one thing that actually researching this was kind of interesting, is when they tried to get food for Old Abe, they would either get chickens, have him get fish, and because of the novelty of them, even Southerners kind of enjoyed giving up a chicken, is that true?
To some degree. So sometimes yes, sometimes no. I read one story where they hadn't had food or rations for 2 days, and so the eagle handler is basically, he went to the colonel asking, hey, I need to get food for this eagle. What should we do? And at the same time, the pickets are not letting him get past without a pass, and so he actually got a pass from the colonel of the 8th, and he got some money that he gave him. I think he gave him $50 to go to this nearby farm and basically pay for 1 or 2 chickens. And the farmer said, yeah, you can take them, but just let us look at the eagle. So they brought Old Abe there. And so there's all these Southern folks that actually did get to see Old Abe kind of in a weird circumstance, but it was like, oh wow, some of them liked him and thought he was great, others despised him, and they actually started nicknaming him the Yankee Buzzard, which was kind of derogatory, obviously, but
so obviously they didn't feel the same as the Confederate that surrendered because
they were
of
not
the
struck
patriotism.
dumb with awe and patriotic fervor and so forth. So
Right.
unfortunately, no, it did not happen that way. But another instance, they basically had to either steal or run off with chickens in order to feed Old Abe, and he did prefer them live. He didn't really like stuff that was already dead, and that's true with most raptors. They really would prefer something fresh versus something that's been sitting out for a while.
Right.
So let's see here. Oh, and then one other really cool thing at a lot of let's see, where was it? I know I have it here somewhere. Anyway, Old Abe would be present at a lot of the dress parades as well. And so he knew exactly what to do. There's this martial air, and he would show off at just the right time. And there were a lot of reviews and for all the generals for the army. And they obviously are going to see this bald eagle just sitting on a perch there, and whenever they would pass, they say he's frequent. One of the eagle handlers said, "I have frequently seen Generals Grant, Sherman, McPherson, Rosecrans, Blair, Logan, and others, when they were passing our regiment, raise their hats as they passed Old Abe, which always brought a cheer from the regiment, and then the eagle would spread his wings." And so, again, you get that patriotic fervor there. But it's just really neat because I've seen similar things with our eagle during shows when the crowd applauds. A lot of our birds can spread their wings out and show off a little bit.
So unfortunately, we're already kind of running out of time.
There's a lot to talk about.
Because we got to get to Old Abe on the post-war side of things.
That's all right, yeah.
So Abe goes through with the 8th of Wisconsin, and of course the 8th of Wisconsin gets not mustered out, but basically they go back for furlough.
Yes, the time comes up 3 years later. The old veterans that survived, they get a furlough. They get to go home to Wisconsin, and Old Abe goes with them. And they got this nice speech from General Fairchild. Was the officer in charge when everyone shows up in Wisconsin, and he did a nice little speech and thanked the regiment for their with a cordial welcome that had been extended to them, and proposed 3 cheers and a big eagle for the Union, the President of the United States, and the state officers of Wisconsin. 3 cheers were given with great enthusiasm by the boys of the 8th, the eagle evidently understanding his part, and at the 3rd hurrah stretched himself to his full height and expanded his wings to the utmost. And while they were there, they did some charity work. They kind of went around while everyone was relaxed. They went to some Ladies' Aid Society meetings and kind of did some PR. And that was Old Abe's first real public relations type thing, and as a celebrity. Furlough ends, they go back to Memphis that September, I believe, and then they decide that the old veterans, they were ready to be mustered out. So shortly after, and Old Abe they decided to be turned over to the state of Wisconsin as a war relic, and he would receive basically an eternal furlough, so he didn't have to go tramping around the South for the remainder of the war. So they turned him over to the state of Wisconsin. He is now going to be housed in the state capitol with his own private apartment. He had 2 rooms with a special bathtub and a variety of perches for him, and a special caretaker that would take him across the street to the park to go hang out. So they took good care of him. Throughout that time, during the end of the war and afterwards, after the war, he went to many events across the country, including the 1865 Northwest Sanitary Fair, the Soldiers' Home Fair, Soldiers' Orphans Home opening, Harvey Hospital opening, the Ladies' Aid Society of Chippewa Falls, lots and lots of patriotic things, parades, that sort of a thing. The 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia as well, and he actually got to be reunited with, as you see here, it was quite a big affair, obviously, being the centennial of the United States. Lots of different things, but they had a special booth set up, and let's see, John Hill, I believe was his name, one of the 5 eagle handlers that survived the war. He actually reunited with Old Abe, and I'm sure for a good sum of money, he did pretty well for himself. They handed out carte de visites of Old Abe, and he actually trained Old Abe to autograph them. And you'll see in this next image, if you look really close, that's a carte de visite of Old Abe, and there is a nice little notch that is nipped out of it. And Old Abe actually would just bite down gently, and he'd leave his mark on that card, and you could get it for a small sum of money. And they made quite a bit doing this. We actually kind of off behind the scenes, we do this at our program for our volunteers and our staff. We have a little card, and actually it's our turkey vulture. She will hold out the card and she'll autograph it in the exact same way, so that's pretty cool. Anyway, so he also participates in the 1880 GAR National Convention. Again, scenes similar to this, lots of parades and people cheering, waving flags, and so forth. He did his part flawlessly, but in 1881, in February, there was a fire in the Capitol building where he stayed, and he actually sounded an alarm. His call. He gave the alarm, and they got him out of there. But he suffered a lot of smoke inhalation, and birds do not handle respiratory issues very well, and it actually caused him to pass away the following March. A month later, he died because of the respiratory issues that he suffered.
Wait, we're already to his death?
Yeah, it's pretty quick.
Wow.
Sorry, we jumped ahead. It was like, we jumped from 1865 to 1880. This is 1881 when this occurred.
So we're talking, 1865, the war ends, and then he gets transferred to the Capitol, and then in 1885, you said?
81.
81, that's when the fire breaks out.
Yes.
And then you said how quick after he died? From the fire to his death?
About a month.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So the fire was the direct result of his death then.
Cause.
Well,
yes.
Yeah. The smoke inhalation.
Yes. And bald eagles will normally live around 25 to 30 years or so in the wild with a little bit of skill, a little bit of luck. In captivity, in the modern day and age, we can actually double that because of providing better nutrition. You get a meal every single day. You also get medical care, which you're not guaranteed in the wild. And so with that quality care, you can drastically extend that life. Now, at the time, this is a bird that's been living in captivity his whole life, and he lived to be 20 years old. And they don't have the same standards that we have today in order to care for these animals in captivity. So that's actually pretty impressive. But he was 20 years old when he passed away. So
just get an idea of how 20 years is. So you said 20 years old is pretty old for an eagle. But then you said for today, if you have them in captivity and you do everything perfect and they have the medication and the treatment that they need, how long can a bald eagle live in captivity today?
In captivity today, with careful care and keeping an eye on the bird, usually 50 to 60 years or so.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's assuming it's a perfect facility with a good budget and everything at their beck and call.
But as far as Old Abe in that situation, 20 years is pretty good.
That's pretty good for the times, because the zoological industry was pretty much non-existent to that degree.
Gotcha.
So not even a sliver of what we have today.
So Old Abe dies, unfortunately, in the fire. Well, actually, after the fire because of smoke inhalation and respiratory distress. And then what happens to him after he dies then?
So then after he dies, he actually was stuffed. He became a piece of taxidermy. He was put in the rotunda of the Capitol. 4 years later, he basically was moved from place to place. 4 years later, he was moved to the GAR Memorial Hall in Wisconsin. And then they moved back to the Capitol in 1903. He actually got to be visited by Teddy Roosevelt, and he commented that he was so excited to see the bird that he'd read about in his school days in person. Unfortunately, though, a year later in 1904, the Capitol caught fire yet again and burned to the ground, including Old Abe. So there was nothing left.
Wait, so
he's gone.
So the Capitol caught fire a second time.
Yes.
That's fun.
Yeah.
And then also, obviously the stuffed or the taxidermy Old Abe, the taxidermy of Old Abe, he burned up, or his body burned up in the second fire of the Capitol building.
Correct.
But I thought in the Wisconsin State House or where it is, there's an eagle up there, isn't there?
There is, yeah. So in 1915, they decided that he was such an influential thing for Wisconsin state history, and that imagery and all the great stories. They made a replacement replica. So there's another taxidermied eagle that sits in the State Assembly chamber, and there's also another one in the Wisconsin Veterans Museum as well, and that symbolizes Old Abe to this day.
So there's two of them.
Yeah.
That symbolize Old Abe that aren't Old Abe at all.
Yeah. No, it's really the idea that counts.
It's the idea. So, okay, so then what happens to the legacy of Old Abe? Are there any actual, like, feathers, or did they save the body? I mean, he burned up, but
he did. Oh, yeah. So
tangible?
as Old Abe is going around the country in all these patriotic parades, the Centennial Exposition, they actually did hand out feathers because it wasn't against the law like it is now to possess an eagle feather without the permits required and all that. And in order to do programs with our birds, we have to have state and federal permits as well. But back then, this bird is naturally molting every single year, and he's systematically replacing all these feathers. And so they started handing them out wherever they go. And so people hung on to those. And there are a few documented historic pieces that actually did have the right, what's the right term? Connections, basically, in the provenance. There we go. That it did belong to Old Abe, and so that's what that photo was. I don't know if you showed it yet. Oh, that one. Yeah, those are all belonged to Old Abe, and people kept them as souvenirs.
Gotcha.
So I think there was. Oh yeah, and so Old Abe's legacy did live on. I mean, this is where you get that iconic bald eagle with that American flag behind you that everyone is familiar with on every 4th of July nowadays. All the commercials, all the everything that you see, that goes back to Old Abe. That was the original, bam, America, love it. That's just the first embodiment of that you're going to see with a live bird of prey.
So then, what's the legacy of Old Abe then? Because there's actually been a lot of things that have been inspired by Old Abe.
There is.
So what are some of the legacy aspects of his time with the 8th of Wisconsin in the Civil War?
Yeah, so if you actually look at the patch for the 101st Airborne, it actually has Old Abe on it. That eagle's on there, the Screaming Eagles. That's Old Abe. That's Old Abe. And the black shield behind it is another reference to another Civil War unit or several units. It's the black shield refers to the black hats of the men from the Iron Brigade. So there were 3 of the, I believe, the 6 units that made up the Iron Brigade did hail from Wisconsin, and so that patch, that's all Civil War history right there. And also the men from the 101st Division during World War I and right after hailed from mostly Wisconsin in that area.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that's kind of the history behind that. You also are going to see Old Abe in a wide variety of monuments. At Vicksburg, the 8th Wisconsin Monument has Old Abe at the top of that obelisk there. You're also going to see the Camp Randall, actually, the entrance to Camp Randall. If you go there nowadays, there is a stone sculpture of Old Abe at the gate that he walked through with the little flags that he held. Case Tractors, which, if I remember correctly, was started their company in 1865 for farm equipment. They actually utilized Old Abe sitting on a globe as their emblem, and I think that lasted until the 1950s or 60s, I believe. So there's a lot of things that Old Abe really influenced that not a lot of people are aware of, and it's just really cool to be able to share that and read about it when you can make the connections.
So, and this is actually kind of interesting, and why I wanted to interview you about Old Abe specifically, because you having, a love of Civil War history, and then, us sharing the 11th OVC or the cavalry side of things, and then combining that with your real job of actually being a raptor handler, this is a unique perspective for sure. I guess, what has been your experience in dealing with raptors or eagles in general, or I guess, why did you think this was important to talk about?
I have 2 degrees. Not to flaunt that or anything. No, it's actually I always wanted to be a zookeeper growing up, but I find myself drawn more and more towards education roles and talking about the stories and the research. But part of that is because I have a degree in zoology, but I also have a degree in history. And history is kind of my hobby, my passion. I used to work for the National Park Service for a number of years, and I just loved talking to people about history. And so this is one of those really cool areas where I have two really obscure degrees. Okay, history's not obscure. I apologize for that. But it's not exactly easy to get a job with a solid history degree. But this is one of those few times where I can take both of those degrees and overlap that and blend them together. So I just started reading about Old Abe, and I can really relate to what the eagle handlers have been going through. And you read their diaries and all these accounts, and there's really not too much written about Old Abe. There's maybe a dozen sources that are in print now. If you can find them, it's really, they're great reads. But they all talk about the way the eagle acted and just the behaviors. I can see these subtleties, and I'm not doing it justice just talking now with you about it. Yeah. But I apologize. But there's little ways that you read the accounts about the eagle handlers working with Old Abe, and I've seen that. I've been able to work with Jade. He is our bald eagle at the center of the West. He is with us because of a wing injury. He was hit when he was 1 year old by a vehicle. He was scavenging on the side of the road, and unfortunately didn't quite get up in the air in time. Due to the extent of damage to his right wing, he can no longer have a steady flight, and so it was deemed that he was non-releasable. He couldn't take care of himself on his own, and that's why he's living with us at the museum. But I got a really unique chance to work with him and totally nerded out because we were getting him used to being up on the glove and doing programs, gradually introducing him to working with people. So normally he sits in an exhibit off the side of the museum. He is out in the garden all the time. That's his room. That's his spot. And people can come by and they can check him out, and he likes talking with them. And just like Old Abe, he loves sitting up on his perch. He'll show off. He loves working the cameras. He'll put his wings out. He'll flap. Sometimes he'll actually cackle at you, which is a lot of fun. We had a service dog with its owner there, and just kind of stand there nice and quiet. Everyone was well behaved, and just sitting there watching. And Jade kind of looked at the dog, and then he'd kind of strike a pose, and they'd look back, and then he kind of chuckled at him, cackled at him, and the dog just sat there looking, and so that was kind of neat to watch from the side there.
Oh, definitely.
But Jade, I was able to actually sort of nerd out and mimic being an eagle handler. My boss let me wear my uniform to work, and I'm using modern safety equipment in working and handling with him. So what I'm using is what we using generally for falconry and a lot of that sort of a thing, just to keep us safe.
The zoomed in image is actually
I carefully cropped all those just because I didn't have the time or the money to make a really fancy shield stand for him, as cool as that would be, and he would be a little weirded out by what the heck is this, and especially when we know he's raised in the wild. He's not an imprint, so imprints are a lot more unpredictable, but they are a lot more easily trained as well. And so Jade is a little higher strung, and so usually we don't do a lot of programs with him on the glove. Instead, we've opted for he can just relax. He can be in that exhibit and be himself and not have to worry about being that close to humans. But that was a really cool opportunity for me to be that close with him and experience.
Well, I mean, one thing that's actually kind of interesting is, and we were talking about this the other day, is we think, I mean, you're I guess combining of your two expertises of Civil War history, being a historian working for the National Park Service, and then combining that with your zoology and working with this raptor and this bald eagle. As far as we know, this is the first time in 150 some years that there has been a quote unquote eagle handler in a Civil War uniform reenacting. I guess I hate to say reenacting, but as far as having this picture that we have that we overlay, I mean that's the first time, as far as we know, that's happened in 150 years.
As far as we know, I'm the first eagle bearer in a long time. It's kind of cool, but and obviously in the modern day and age, you're not going to ever see that on a reenactment field or any sort of programming like that, usually just because it's a wild animal. probably not the same. You can't get away with what you used to back in the day.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
so one question that I have is, have you actually had any other eagles come through your place?
yes, not directly with us. We're not a rehabilitation center. However, all of our birds have come to us from a wildlife rehabilitation center. But one common thing that we're finding, unfortunately, it's very widespread, is the eagles that are coming into the rehab center have lead poisoning. And
oh, really?
Yes, and it sounds bad, and it's obviously not a good thing.
Lead from what though?
Lead ammunition. And bear with me because it sounds terrible at first. But what's actually happening, what we've been finding, is that a lot of different raptors are ingesting lead fragments. And this is
from hunting.
From hunting, yes. Yeah. So when lead hits soft tissue and bone, and as many of us are familiar with the Civil War, when lead hits bone, it's going to shatter the bone, but as it's passing through that soft tissue, that meat, that muscle, it's losing small pieces of it, and it's a very soft material, and so that actually happens when you shoot, say, a deer, for example. And if you look at it on a microscopic level, there's little tiny traces of that lead bullet that's passing through. So a lot of times what happens when people gut a game animal, they will actually, I'm not saying what anyone does, but say you gut everything, you leave the guts behind, it feeds the birds. It's actually great. Hunting helps raptors. It provides an easy source of nutrition that they don't have to work too hard for. Unfortunately, they don't know there's lead fragments in there, and they will eat that, and their livers can't process that. They will get a bad case of lead poisoning, and more often than not, it leads to a pretty slow and painful death. So
this is interesting because, with lead bullets being used in the Civil War, obviously, Old Abe survived 20 years in the war with all that lead flying around.
Yeah.
From a hunting perspective, it's spread out enough. How bad of a problem is this actually?
It actually affects not just bald eagles, but lots of other raptors. It's hawks, eagles, both bald and golden eagles. Like I said, they scavenge quite commonly. They'll take advantage of a meal, but it also affects California condors. That's the main reason why they're on the endangered species list, is due to lead poisoning. And to make it even a little more personal, though, our rehabilitation center in Cody, just 2 weeks ago, there was a golden eagle that had really bad lead poisoning and ended up having to be euthanized because it was so severe.
So this lead thing is actually a big deal.
It is. So that's why we encourage folks and hunters to switch to a non-lead ammunition.
Which they're getting better.
It's getting better about it. Yeah, no, it's good. But and the hard part is, for those of us that shoot antique firearms, you want a soft material and not damage the bore. So
right.
The debate continues. But in order to help some of these birds in the wild, we encourage people to switch to a non-lead ammunition. This last week, a bald eagle came in with another really high rates of lead poisoning. So far, it's doing all right, but unfortunately, that's not the single case. So, yeah,
right.
That's that story on that.
So actually, and the reason we bring this up, especially for everyone watching, whether you're watching live or whether you're watching later on the recording, if you take a look at our 11th OVC Facebook page, we actually shared a fundraiser, basically, that you can actually donate, and 100% of the proceeds, everything you donate, will be sent to actually help the Draper Museum of Natural History to care for those raptors, correct?
Yes, yeah. So all of the birds are with us for life, and so you can imagine how, if we can double their lifespans in captivity, giving them a meal every single day, and making sure they're really well cared for, covering medical costs, all of those donations go directly towards caring for those birds. We don't use them for any office costs or anything. And also, spreading the word about wildlife conservation, and also, the story of Old Abe as well.
No, that's awesome. So like I said, guys, all those of you watching, whether it's live or not, please go to our Facebook page, take a look at the fundraiser that we shared, and donate. Our goal is $500 to care for the raptors specifically, what they have as far as the care program there at the Draper Natural Museum. Or the
Draper Museum Raptor Experience
Sorry.
At the Draper Natural History Museum at the Buffalo Bill Center, the West End Cody.
There you go. So, with that being said, then, just anything else you want to cover about the story of Old Abe?
No, I think we pretty much skimmed through everything. I would strongly encourage everyone, if you get the chance, look up Old Abe and go to your libraries and try to find some of the original primary documents. The one that I really relied on was the Soldier Bird, History of Old Abe, the Live War Eagle, and that was by Joseph O. Barrett, who was alive and got to see Old Abe in his glory.
Which actually is interesting, because when we were doing the research for this live stream, the book that we use and for the most reference is actually a book written in 1865. This on the same year that the war ended, and that's especially from reading the excerpts and kind of skimming through what we have. I would say it's one of the better books out there, at least primary source. You could all argue that book itself is a primary source.
Oh yeah, definitely. And there is only got probably about 70, 80 pages in it or so.
Oh, really?
So yeah, it's relatively quick read. So if you want to learn a little more about Old Abe, there's lots of really cool stories in there, and there's a couple other sources as well. So
gotcha.
Yeah, check it out.
Awesome. So what we're going to do now, that's, I guess, the end of our formal live stream.
Yes.
We will take questions, though. And it looks actually, we have a question from 50 Tennessee CSA. He says, so what exactly is it legal to have eagle feathers? So I'm assuming, obviously, what's the issue with having eagle feathers, and is it legal, and when is it legal?
Yes, so that's interesting you bring that up. So in order to possess eagle feathers in the modern day and age, you have to be, you have to have a permit from the federal government. And the reason why is because for a while there, actually, bald eagles were considered a nuisance. They were a pest. There were so many of them, and they were getting into all sorts of fisheries and farms and going after chickens and that sort of thing, among other things. And there was actually bounties on them, even up until the 1950s, I believe, late 1940s, 1950s in Alaska. It was about 25 to 50 cents if you brought in a pair of bald eagle legs. And so they were just considered a nuisance. And so it got so bad through a variety of factors. Bald eagles were not doing that well, and you didn't see very many of them. In fact, a lot of my family that was alive at the time in the later half of the 20th century, they didn't see a lot of bald eagles. And now, due to a lot of conservation efforts, for example, the banning of DDT, a pesticide that was in use that not only affected bald eagles, but osprey, peregrine falcons, lots of other birds as well. And it really affected them to the point that there weren't many of them around. And now, due to those conservation efforts, you can see bald eagles all across the United States, almost everywhere again. And they're doing really, really well. They have stable populations.
So so that's why they made it illegal, is just to bring them back and have people not hunt them or
correct.
Search
Yeah.
them for the
Sorry.
feathers.
So bringing it back to the feathers. So basically, they didn't want people to be able to have these parts because I believe it was in 1950 or 1952. There's the Golden and Bald Eagle Protection Act. I have to double check the dates on that again. Sorry. But basically, you cannot harm, harass, or injure or kill any of these eagles or acquire body parts of them without a permit because they don't want... Great, I'm rambling. Let's see. Going back. Sorry. There's so much going on in my mind right now. Basically, they don't want people going out and acquiring all of these feathers and not knowing how you got them. For all they know, you could have gone out and shot the bird, which is against the law. And so a lot of it has to do with Native Americans. They have to have their own permit in order to possess these feathers as well. That's one of the things that we do with all of our birds as they molt their feathers. my job is to go out and gather them up. At the end of the year, for all of these feathers, we send them down to the Eagle Repository down in Denver, Colorado, and they get distributed to the various Native American tribes and for their own uses through that. So
Gotcha.
does that answer it, kind of, sort of?
Yeah, I'm sure it does.
Clear as mud.
So
it's an interesting side history thing, just to kind of look at the legislation in protecting birds and birds of prey.
So one of the other comments that the 50th Tennessee CSA said, more of a statement than a question, is kind of the idea of mascots, right? So again, we had other regiments with dogs, but apparently the 3rd Tennessee had a rooster, Jake the Rooster from the 3rd Tennessee. Do you know of any other, I guess off the top of my head I don't know, but do you know any other, I guess, mascots that were kind of unique other than like a dog or something like that?
Yeah. There's a couple, and forgive me, I don't remember the exact units that had these mascots. I remember reading about, there was a wildcat or a bobcat, a southern unit had. There was a bear. One unit had
a bear?
A young black bear.
Wow.
Yeah. And I know the roosters were very popular, and I'm trying to think. The article in about Old Abe, one of the articles referred to mascots in the Crimean War. Cats were actually very popular, and as the guys were marching out, they had cats on the top of their knapsacks that would just sit there and hang on. So that was kind of an interesting little nugget of information there. But those are the main ones that come to mind. I know dogs, there's numerous dogs over the years of the war. I think those are the most strange ones. They did have a golden eagle. It was not as well known of a unit. There was another Wisconsin unit, but it didn't gain nearly as much fame as Old Abe.
Awesome. Well, I think we'll call that good.
Okay.
Took a couple questions, a little bit over an hour. With that, Brandon, appreciate you coming and bringing your unique perspective of being a raptor handler, an eagle handler, and of course your love of Civil War history. So appreciate your time. Everyone who's listening, again, either live or later on, please go to our Facebook page and please support the Draper Natural Museum.
Draper Museum Raptor Experience.
Yes.
There you go.
There you go. Please go to our Facebook page and donate. Again, 100% of those proceeds go to support those birds and continue basically the legacy that Old Abe continued as far as appreciating the raptors, appreciating birds of prey, and ultimately the patriotism of America. So appreciate it, Brandon.
And if you have any questions, please message us, and I'll do my best to answer your questions that are related to this topic here, and try to clear things up for you if you have any difficulty with my jumble of words and stuff. It's late at night, man. We just finished riding for like 6 hours today.
Yeah, 6 hours at the trot.
In non-stop, like 60-mile-an-hour winds. So, man, I'm just out of it. So, sorry.
Well, appreciate it, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Appreciate it.